The air in the small practice room was still and warm, heavy with the smell of old wood, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of lemon oil from the polished floor. It was a smell that clung to the old conservatory building, a smell that meant work. The only window was open a crack, letting in a distant, muted hum of city traffic. But it did little to cool the room or ease the tension. The young man sat perfectly still on the piano bench, his shoulders loose, but his spine straight. His name was Leo, and he was 22. His hands rested lightly on his knees, fingers long and slender, the pads of his fingertips slightly calloused. He faced the broad, dark shape of the grand piano, a silent beast waiting to be tamed. His eyes were closed. They had been that way, by necessity, since he was 8 years old. But here, in this room, he closed them out of habit, out of deep focus, pulling the world in instead of pushing it out. Across from him, leaning against the window frame with arms crossed, was his teacher. The old man, whom everyone called Maestro Valery, was a figure carved from granite and old cigar smoke. His hair was a wild, wiry gray cloud, and his brow seemed permanently furrowed, as if constantly listening for a mistake in life's symphony. He had a reputation for being merciless, for chewing up talented students and spitting out only the truly resilient. He believed in breaking down a musician to see what they were made of, to find the core that wouldn't crack under pressure. Well, Valerie's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. The clock is ticking. The audition panel does not wait for a boy to find his courage. Leo gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't need to see to know the maestro's expression, the impatience, the skepticism. He could hear it in the man's breathing, in the faint tap of a foot against the floorboard. This wasn't just another lesson. This was the final preparation for the most important audition of his life. A chance to compete on an international stage. A chance to prove that a blind pianist wasn't just a novelty, but an artist thought, and the challenge Valery had set was, in Leo's private opinion, cruel. The piece was Franz Liszt's La Campanella, the Little Bell. It was a monster of a composition, a whirlwind of dizzyingly fast notes, leaps that spanned half the keyboard, and a relentless, sparkling high melody that was supposed to sound like the clear, joyous ringing of bells. Playing it from memory was expected. Playing it flawlessly was the dream of every young virtuoso. But Valery had added a twist. Earlier that morning, before Leo arrived, the maestro had asked a technician to deliberately put the piano a quarter tone out of tune. Not a lot, just enough to make every chord feel sour, every interval subtly wrong. It was a deviation so slight, a casual listener might feel unsettled without knowing why. But to a trained ear, especially one as finely calibrated as Leo's, it was like walking through a familiar house where all the floors were slanted. Any fool with muscle memory can play the notes they've drilled into their hands, Valery had said, his tone leaving no room for argument. A parrot can do that. I don't need to hear a parrot. I need to hear a musician. I need to know if you can think the music, not just regurgitate it. You must play what should be heard, not what this broken instrument is giving you. A broken instrument. The words had stung. To Leo, a piano was never just an object. It was a partner, a living thing with a voice and a soul. Forcing it to lie felt like a betrayal. Now, sitting before it, Leo pushed the emotion down. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford in this exercise. He lifted his hands, letting them hover over the keys. He didn't plunge in. First, he had to listen. He had to map the new, warped landscape of this piano. He stretched out his right index finger and, with deliberate care, pressed down on a single key. An A above middle C dot, the note bloomed in the quiet room. But it wasn't his A, his perfect, internal A. The one he carried in his head, like a tuning fork made of pure light, was a clear silver tone. This was different. This A was duller, slightly flattened, leaning towards an A-flat. It didn't ring true. It rang with a question. He let the sound decay into silence. In his mind, he didn't hear the flawed note. He heard the ghost of the correct one. He saw it too. Since the accident that stole his sight, sound had taken on color and shape in his mind, a condition his doctors called synesthesia. His perfect A was a shimmering metallic silver. This out-of-tune impostor was a tarnished gray version of it. He played the A again, then the E above it, testing the fifth interval. Instead of a clean, open sound, it was a narrow, slightly sour clash. The room seemed to absorb the discord, holding its breath. Leo's closed eyes tightened. This was the hard part. His entire body, his muscle memory, was screaming to correct his finger placement, to slide slightly, to find a purer note. But he couldn't. The geography of the keyboard was fixed. The error was in the piano's voice, not his hands. The correction had to happen entirely in his mind. He began. The first few notes of La Campanella are a playful, dancing cascade. Leo's fingers moved, light and precise. But the sound that came out was jarring. It was like hearing a familiar song played on a child's toy piano. The melody was there, but the spirit was wrong, warped. He forced himself not to react. He kept his breathing even. Inside his head, he was constructing a parallel performance. He heard the piece as it was meant to be, a shower of brilliant, golden sparks for the high notes, deep indigo pools for the lower chords. He fed that perfect, internal recording to his hands, commanding his fingers to trust the map they knew, even if the territory was distorted. The real, physical sound coming from the piano was a shadow of this, a murky, off-kilter echo. He was playing a duet between the ideal in his mind and the flawed reality in the room, and he had to ignore the latter completely. Valerie did not move. He didn't offer encouragement or criticism. He was a statue of judgment, his sharp ears dissecting every phrase. The only sounds were the deliberately wrong music and the soft, rhythmic sigh of Leo's breathing God as Leo navigated into a particularly treacherous run of rapid octaves. His concentration was absolute. The world narrowed to the feel of the cool ivory under his fingertips, the slight give of the keys, and the radiant, colorful architecture of the music he was building in the darkness behind his eyes. The out-of-tune notes were like static, like rain on a window pane present, but easy to look past if you focused on the landscape beyond. He finished the first page of the piece and transitioned into a slower, more lyrical section. Here, the tuning's flaw was even more apparent. A lush chord that should have sounded rich and comforting instead felt thin and uneasy, like a sweet drink that had gone slightly bitter. A flicker of frustration sparked in Leo's chest. This was absurd. Why should he have to fight his own instrument? Music was about truth, not this forced deception. But as quickly as the thought came, he banished it. He remembered Valerie's words. Life is out of tune, boy. This wasn't just about the piano. This was a test of his will. Could he hold fast to his own inner truth when everything outside him was pulling him off key? He dug deeper. He stopped trying to fight the wrong notes and instead started listening through them. He focused on the resonance of the strings, the physical vibration he could feel in the floorboards, in the bench. He tuned his attention to the ghost of the correct harmony that lived underneath the discord, the way you can sometimes hear a melody if you hum against a dissonant chord. The music changed. It didn't suddenly become in tune, but it gained a strange new authority. Leo was no longer a victim of the bad piano. He was its master, imposing his will upon it. He was playing what should be heard, and the actual sound became almost irrelevant, a mere byproduct of a greater mental act. The room which had felt tense and critical, seemed to shift. The silence that wrapped around the notes was no longer just an absence of sound. It became a space of intense concentration, a collective holding of breath. Even Valerie's stern presence seemed to soften a fraction. Absorbed into the singular effort unfolding at the piano, Leo played on, eyes closed, navigating the glittering, bell-like passages of the piece, not by sight or by the false sound in his ears, but by the brilliant, unwavering map of the music that lived, perfect and whole, inside him. The silent room was his witness. The music from the practice room faded, replaced by the sterile, sharp smell of antiseptic. It was a smell that lived in the back of Leo's mind, a ghost that sometimes visited when he was tired or stressed. As his fingers had wrestled with the out-of-tune piano, that ghost had tugged at him, pulling him back to where it all began. He was 8 years old, and he could see the world was a bombardment of glorious, almost painful color. He remembered that most of all the color. The searing blue of a summer sky, the electric green of fresh-cut grass, the violent red of the taillights on the family car ahead of them on the highway. It was late, and he was in the back seat, forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the world streak by in a blur of light and dark. His father was driving, humming along to a song on the radio. His mother was in the passenger seat, her head tilted back. Asleep, there was no sense of impending doom. Just the gentle rumble of the engine, the drone of the tires on asphalt, and a growing, dull throb behind his own eyes. He'd had a headache all afternoon, a pulsing ache that made the bright lights of other cars seem to starburst. Then, the red taillights ahead suddenly multiplied, blossoming into a chaotic garden of crimson. His father swore, a short, sharp sound. There was a scream of brakes, not just from their car, but from everywhere, a metallic chorus. The world, which had been a horizontal stream, suddenly spun. Leo was thrown forward, the seatbelt catching him hard, snapping the breath from his lungs. Glass tinkled like a terrible, tiny bell. Then a profound, ringing silence. The next part was a mosaic of fragments. Flashing blue and red lights painting the interior of the car in strabbing slices. A stranger's face, pale and concerned, framed by a crumpled window frame. The feeling of being lifted, of cool night air on his skin. And through it all, the headache, now a roaring, all-consuming pressure behind his eyes. As if the colors of the crash had been too bright and had burned into his vision. When he woke up properly, he was in a bed that wasn't his. The world was not dark. It was a deep, velvety, all-encompassing blue. A blue so complete it felt like a place. He could hear beeping machines, the squeak of shoes on linoleum, the low murmur of voices. He tried to blink the blue away, but it stayed. "Mom?" His voice sounded small and scratchy. He heard a gasp, then the sound of a chair scraping. A hand found his, warm and familiar. It was his mother's. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. Why is it so blue?" He asked. A silence that followed was heavy, filled with things too big for an 8-year-old to understand. The doctor explained later, in gentle terms, about swelling, about the optic nerve. The word permanent was used. Leo didn't cry then. He was too confused. The world had simply changed color, from a million shades to one single, endless blue. He thought maybe it would fade, like a bruise, but it didn't fade. The blue just became his new normal. The doctors called it his residual light perception, but to Leo, it wasn't light. It was a color. The color of D-flat major, though he didn't know that yet. The days in the hospital bled into one another, a monotonous tapestry of smells, sounds, and that constant blue. He felt adrift, unmoored from everything he knew. He could hear the world, but it was like listening to a radio play without pictures, frustrating and incomplete. Then, one afternoon, his father came in. He could tell it was him by the sound of his walk, a slightly heavier step than the nurse's, and by his smell, a mix of coffee and the outside air. "Brought you something, kiddo?" his father said. His voice was trying to be cheerful, but Leo could hear the strain underneath, like a guitar string tuned too tight. He felt a large, rectangular object being placed on his lap. It was light, made of plastic. His fingers explored it, finding a row of smooth, cool buttons. "It's a keyboard," his father said. "A little one. You know, for music." Leo pressed a button. A sound jumped out, a short, digital beep. It was a cheap, tinny sound, nothing like the rich piano in his school music room. But it was a definite sound. It had a shape in the blue darkness. What was that? His father asked. Leo pressed it again. The same beep. "It's a little square," Leo said, surprised at his own words. "A white square?" His father was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said slowly. "Press another one." Leo slid his finger to the right, pressed a different button. This note was higher. It didn't feel like a square. "This one is pointy, like a triangle, a yellow triangle." He moved to a lower note. This one felt round and dark in his mind. "This is a circle, a brown circle." He didn't know he was describing synesthesia. He was just telling the truth. Each sound had a shape, a color, a texture in the blue landscape of his sight. The cheap keyboard wasn't an instrument. It was a translator. It was taking the invisible, confusing world of sounds and giving them form. It was making the unseen seen. His father, a man who strummed guitars on weekends for fun, began to visit every day with the little keyboard. He'd play a simple melody, "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," or the theme from a cartoon they used to watch together. Leo would listen, and in his mind, he wouldn't see stars or characters. He'd see a string of glowing shapes, a silver star, a rolling green hill, a burst of orange sparks. The music painted pictures on the canvas of his blindness. His father taught him chords. A major chord wasn't just a happy sound. It was a stable, solid structure in his mind, like a warm, sunlit wooden tube. A minor chord was the same tube, but made of cooler, shadowy stone. Music became his architecture. It was how he built a new world inside his head, a world far more vivid and reliable than the fading memory of the sighted one. When he was finally allowed home, the real piano in the living room became his sanctuary. The cheap plastic keyboard had shown him the way, but this was a universe. Each key, when pressed, didn't just make a sound. It opened a door. The low bass notes were deep, rolling caverns of purple and black. The middle notes were forests of green and gold. The high treble notes were sunlight on water, or shards of clear ice. He learned to read Braille music, his fingers flying over the raised dots, translating them directly into colors and shapes in his mind before they ever reached his hands. He wasn't memorizing notes. He was memorizing landscapes. A piece of music was a journey through a country he could map with perfect clarity. The accident, the blue darkness, the loss, it had all carved out a space inside him. And into that space, music had poured, filling it not with silence, but with a roaring, brilliant, colorful symphony that only he could see. It was his secret language, his private sight. When he sat at a piano and closed his eyes, he wasn't shutting the world out. He was stepping into his own. A present-day practice room felt like a cage. The air, once thick with potential, now seemed thin and stale, recycled through Leo's growing frustration. He had been at it for hours, the same few pages of La Campanella, over and over. The out-of-tune piano was no longer a puzzle to solve. It was an adversary, and it was starting to win. His head throbbed. It was a specific, familiar ache, a tight band of pressure starting at the base of his skull and squeezing forward. It was the same kind of headache he'd had in the back of the car all those years ago. A psychosomatic ghost, his therapist had called it. The body remembering what the mind tried to forget. He forced his way through another run of the bell-like high notes. In his mind, they were supposed to be shards of crystal, splinters of pure white light. But the flawed piano twisted them. They came out as jagged, yellowed things, like broken teeth. Each discordant chime felt like a tiny hammer tap on the band of pain in his head. He slammed his hands down on a crashing chord, not as part of the music, but in pure irritation. The sound was an ugly, sour clang that died quickly in the dampened room. You are fighting it. Valerie's voice cut through the aftermath. He hadn't moved from his spot by the window. You are wrestling the piano like it is a stubborn animal. That is not control. That is a child's tantrum. Leo took a sharp breath, his fingers curling into tense fists on his knees. It's an impossible task, he said, his voice tighter than he intended. You're asking me to pour perfect water into a cracked cup and pretend it isn't leaking. A real musician, a true artist, respects their instrument. They wouldn't tolerate this. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge. He heard the soft shuffle of fabric as Valerie uncrossed his arms. A real musician, Valerie said, his voice deceptively quiet, understands that the instrument is always flawed. The piano in the concert hall, the one you dream of playing, it is wood and wire and felt. It expands with heat, contracts with cold. The air in the room changes its voice. The pianist himself is flawed, tired fingers, a wandering mind, a nervous heart. He took a step closer. Leo could smell the old wool of his jacket, a hint of coffee. The music you hold in your head, that perfect idea, it can never exist in the world. Not truly. The crack in the cup is not the problem. The problem is your anger at the water for getting wet. Leo turned his head, his closed eyes facing the direction of Valerie's voice. So what am I supposed to do? Just accept that it will always sound wrong? No, Valerie said. You listen for the harmony hiding within the wrong. Life is out of tune, boy. Every day. People say things they do not mean. Plans fall apart. Beautiful moments are edged with sadness. Your job, your only job as an artist, is to find the true note that exists in relation to the discord. Not the perfect note in your imagination. The true one in the room. It sounded like philosophical nonsense to Leo in that moment. His head hurt. The beautiful, color-coded country of the music in his mind was being invaded by this relentless, off-key noise. He felt a deep, isolating loneliness. Valerie could see the piano. He could walk away from it. Leo was trapped with its false voice, a voice that was actively trying to dismantle his internal world. Again, Valerie commanded, his tone leaving no room for debate. From the top. And this time, do not play against the wrong notes. Listen for what they create. Listen for the new shape. Defeated, Leo placed his hands back on the keys. He started the opening cascade. The wrong notes jangled, sour and insistent. He tried to follow Valerie's instruction, to not fight them. But letting them in felt like a violation. It felt like allowing the deep blue darkness of his blindness, a darkness he had transformed into something beautiful, to become just dark again, empty. He stumbled in the middle of a rapid passage, his hands tangling. He stopped. The silence was humiliating. I can't, Leo whispered, the confession scraping his throat. I can't find it when everything is a lie. Valerie did not offer comfort. The audition is in 48 hours, he stated, a simple, brutal fact. The panel will not care if you had a headache or if you find the exercise unfair. They will hear only what comes from the piano. They will judge only that. He heard the old man's footsteps move towards the door. Stay work or do not. The choice is yours. The door opened, and a wave of cooler air from the hallway swept in. Then it closed with a soft final click. Leo was alone with the flawed beast. For a long time, he didn't move. The phantom ache in his head pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He felt the weight of all of it, the years of work, the constant need to prove himself, the memory of the blue hospital room, the fear that maybe Valerie was right. Maybe his entire inner world, his brilliant synesthetic landscape, was just a fragile fantasy. Maybe it couldn't survive contact with the real, messy, out-of-tune world. He thought about quitting, just getting up, feeling his way to the door, and leaving. The thought was a dark, tempting shape. Slowly, almost against his will, his right hand reached out. He didn't play a note from Liszt. He pressed a single key, then another a half step away, creating the most basic, ugly dissonance possible. He let the horrible sound vibrate in the air. He didn't try to correct it in his mind. He just listened to it. He listened past his initial disgust. He focused on the physical sensation, the way the two clashing sound waves seemed to beat against each other in the air, creating a rough, living texture. It wasn't a color. It was a feeling. A grating, uncomfortable feeling, but a real one. He played the two notes again, and then added a third, lower note from another part of the keyboard. Something shifted. The clash didn't resolve into sweetness, but it mutated into something more complex, a strange, unsettled chord that had its own kind of gravity. It wasn't pretty, but it wasn't a lie anymore. It was a truth about this piano right now. A flicker of something sparked in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. Maybe Valerie's true note wasn't about finding a hidden perfection. Maybe it was about being so utterly honest about the flaw that the performance itself became authentic. He wiped his palms on his trousers. The headache was still there, a dull background noise, but it wasn't the focus anymore. He placed his hands in the starting position for La Campanella. He didn't think about crystal bells or white light. He thought about the feel of the keys, the specific resistance of this action, the slightly metallic tinge he now knew lived in every note this piano produced. He began to play. Not the perfect piece in his head, but a duet between that perfect piece and the very real, very imperfect instrument in front of him. He wasn't ignoring the wrong notes. He was acknowledging them, weaving them into the intent. It was slower. It was more careful. It was, in a way, entirely new music. And for the first time that afternoon, he played to the end of the section without stopping. The room, empty save for him, was no longer silent with judgment. It was listening, and so was he. The hallway of the concert hall was a canyon of sound. It was a busy, echoing space where noise came from everywhere, the muffled thump of a double bass from a distant practice room, the chatter of other auditionees, the sharp click of dress shoes on marble, the squeak of a custodial cart. For Leo, it was a confusing map written in audio. He kept one hand lightly on the wall, following his teacher's lead. Maestro Valerie walked beside him, a silent, steady presence. He hadn't said much that morning, just a firm grip on Leo's shoulder before they left the apartment and a single, gruff piece of advice. Remember the crack in the cup. Now they stopped. The ambient noise changed. The hallway sounds faded, replaced by a hushed, expectant quiet that seemed to seep from under a heavy door. This was the antechamber to the main stage. "They are running late," a woman's voice said, polite but impersonal. "You will be next. You may wait here." Valerie guided him to a stiff, velvet-covered bench. "Sit, breathe. They will call you." Leo sat. He could feel the thick tension in the air, a cocktail of other people's anxiety and hope. He heard a young woman a few feet away, humming a rapid scale under her breath. He heard the nervous jiggling of someone's knee. He focused on his own breathing, on the feel of the new, stiff fabric of his suit against his skin. He ran through the colorful architecture of La Campanella in his mind, not note by note, but as a landscape, the winding silver paths, the deep green valleys of the quieter passages, the sudden sun-gold peaks, time-stretched and compressed. Then a heavy door opened with a deep thud. He heard footsteps exit, some quick and light, some slow and heavy. A defeated sigh from somewhere nearby. Then the woman's voice again, calling his name and his number. Valerie's hand was on his shoulder once more. A brief, hard squeeze. No words. Then Leo was moving forward, his white cane tapping, led by the woman's voice saying, "This way, please." Mind the step up. He crossed a threshold, and the air changed completely. It was cooler, vaster. His footsteps, the tap of his cane, made a different sound, a slight, expansive echo. He was on the stage. The quiet from before was now a profound, listening silence. He knew, without seeing, that he was facing a void dotted with people. The audition panel. He could feel their collective gaze, a physical pressure on his skin. "You may begin when you are ready," a man's voice said from the darkness. It was neutral, giving nothing away. Leo nodded. He found the curve of the piano bench with the back of his legs and sat. He placed his folded cane carefully on the floor beside him. This was the ritual. He extended his hands, letting his fingers glide silently over the keys of the grand piano, from one end to the other, acquainting himself. It was a beautiful instrument. He could tell by the sheer, responsive feel of the keys, the slight, eager vibration that hummed through the frame even before a note was struck. This was it. The moment. He settled his feet on the pedals. He took a deep, centering breath, pulling the silence into his lungs. He closed his eyes, shutting out even the memory of light, and stepped fully into the country of his mind. He pictured the first sparkling run of notes. He heard them, perfect and clear, in his inner ear. He was ready to wrestle the discord, to find the true note within the wrong, just as he had practiced. His fingers came down in the opening cascade. The sound that filled the hall was not a warped shadow. It was brilliant. It was pristine. It was perfectly, impeccably in tune. The shock was so total, so physical, it was like missing a step in the dark. His perfect internal A, the shimmering silver, one matched exactly the A that rang out from the piano. There was no sour hint, no leaning flat. It was crystal. It was a bell, truly struck. For 3 full seconds, his hands faltered. The beautifully precise notes, the ones he had drilled for months, stumbled over each other. His muscle memory, pre-programmed to compensate for a quarter-tone error, was now the source of the error. His mind, primed for a fight, was disarmed. The landscape in his head, so carefully built to include crooked trees and slanted hills, was suddenly, violently corrected. It was vertigo. The music stuttered. A wrong note, a real wrong note, one of his own making, clashed hideously against the pure harmony of the piano. It echoed in the vast hall, a tiny, brutal confession of failure. He stopped. The silence that rushed in was alive. It was a thick, swallowing entity. It wasn't the focused quiet of the practice room. This was the silence of 100 held breaths, of raised eyebrows, of pens hovering over paper. It was a judgment so loud it was deafening. In that silence, he could hear everything. The faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat, a dry cough from the back, the distant, mocking memory of Valerie's voice. They will hear only what comes from the piano. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Cold sweat prickled on the back of his neck. This was the nightmare. Not failing at the hard task, but failing at the easy one. They hadn't given him a twisted test. They had given him a perfect instrument, and he had broken the music all by himself. The crack wasn't in the cup. It was in him. The temptation to flee was an almost physical pull. To mumble an apology, fumble for his cane, and stumble off into the dark. To let the narrative complete itself. The blind pianist who couldn't handle the pressure. The novelty act who fell apart when the real world didn't match his private one. He sat in the pit of that silence, his useless hands hovering over the keys that had betrayed him by being perfect. The beautiful, colorful world inside him was gone, wiped clean by panic, replaced by the sterile blue of his childhood darkness. The same blue from the hospital, the blue of emptiness. He was 8 years old again, in that bed, asking why everything was blue dot, and then, as if from a million miles away, he heard it. Not from the hall, from inside the blue. A single pure tone. It was his note, the one he'd always had. The silver A that existed before the accident, before the piano, before any of this. It was the pitch of his own memory, his own truth. The shock began to melt, not into calm, but into a strange, clear emptiness. He had nothing left to lose. The performance he had planned was already in ruins at his feet. The perfect instrument demanded a perfect response, and he had none dot, so he let go. He stopped trying to play the piece that was in his muscle memory. He stopped trying to be clever, to be resilient, to prove anything to anyone in the dark. He exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to come from the soles of his feet. He simply listened to the silence, and to that one pure note inside him dot, and then, very slowly, he began again. He didn't start at the beginning. He found a middle phrase, a lyrical, climbing line. He played it not with virtuoso speed, but with simple honesty. He listened, truly listened, to the piano's real voice, pristine and singing. He let that real sound meet the color in his mind. The high note wasn't a shard of crystal anymore. It was the feeling of cool water. The chord underneath wasn't a green forest. It was the scent of damp earth after rain. He was no longer performing Liszt. He was translating him. He was taking the composer's blueprint and building it anew, right here, with this wood and wire and felt, filtered through his own heart and history. He played the joy of the bells, but also the loneliness of the boy in the blue room. He played the technical fury, but also the years of stubborn practice in silent apartments. He played the beauty, but also the ever-present haunting discord of a world forever altered. He forgot the panel. He forgot the audition. He forgot the past and the future. There was only the present vibration of string, the press of key, the story unfolding in a language of sound only he could fully understand, but was now desperately trying to speak. When the final, ringing chord faded, it didn't drop into the same kind of silence. This silence was different. It was full. It was the silence after a truth has been spoken, hanging in the air, waiting to be absorbed. Leo lowered his hands to his lap. They were trembling. He sat in the fullness of that quiet, not knowing what would come next, but knowing, for the first time that day, that he had played something real. Leo sat on the bench, the final chord still vibrating in the wood beneath him, humming up through the soles of his shoes. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a held breath, a collective pause thick with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't the harsh, judging quiet from after his stumble. This was heavier, warmer, like the air just before a summer rain. He could feel the heat of the stage lights on his skin, a physical pressure. His own heartbeat, which had been a frantic drum in his chest, slowed to a deep, weary thud. He was spent. Every ounce of the fight, the fear, the years of practice had been poured into those last minutes. What was left was a hollow shell, waiting to see if it would be filled with approval or rejection. In the dark behind his eyes, He saw no colors now, just a peaceful drifting gray. He had done it. He had let the music happen. That was all. Dot from the void in front of him. There was a sound. A single dry, deliberate clap. Dot. It wasn't applause. It was too slow, too isolated. It was a period at the end of a sentence. Then another clap, and another. A measured, solitary rhythm cutting through the silence. Leo knew that cadence. It was the sound of Maestro Valerie's hands, calloused and strong. He was clapping not from the panel's table, but from the very back of the hall, where he had been standing silently. The sound was a beacon in the dark. Then, as if Valerie's signal had broken a spell, the rest of the sound rushed in. It wasn't a roaring, standing ovation. It was a wave of release, a rustle of movement, the clearing of a throat, the solid, unified sound of 24 pairs of hands coming together in genuine, if polite, applause. It was the sound of professional respect. It was more real to Leo's ears than any cheering crowd could have been. A voice from the panels. Table cut through the clapping. "Thank you," a sane, neutral man's voice said. "That will be all. You may collect your things." The dismissal was efficient, cold. The applause stopped abruptly. The world snapped back into its procedural frame. Leo felt a wave of disorientation. What did it mean? Was the clapping good? Was the swift dismissal bad? His mind, so sure and clear during the music, was now a jumble of doubts. He leaned down, his fingers searching for and finding the cool, folded metal of his white cane. He snapped it open, the click echoing too loudly. As he stood, his legs felt unsteady. He tapped his way towards the edge of the stage, towards the remembered location of the steps, guided now by the soft footsteps of the same woman who had led him out. She took his elbow, her touch impersonal. "This way, please." He was led back through the heavy door into the antechamber. The air here was different, again charged with the anxiety of the next waiting candidate. He heard a quick, whispered "good luck" from the young woman who had been humming earlier. He nodded in her direction, unable to form words. And then he was back in the hallway canyon of sounds. But he didn't have to navigate it alone. A familiar, heavy hand landed on his shoulder. "Walk," Valerie's voice grumbled beside him. "No question, no. How do you feel?" Just a command to move. They walked in silence through the echoing halls, out a heavy side door, and into the shock of the open air. The city sounds were a roar after the hall's sacred silence, cars, horns, distant sirens, the scuffle of feet on pavement. Leo breathed in the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. It was real, ugly, and grounding. They walked for a block before Valerie steered him into a small, quiet park. The sounds softened, replaced by birds and the sigh of wind in late autumn leaves. Valerie guided him to a bench. "Sit." They sat. Leo waited, his cane held tightly between his knees. He was braced for the critique, for the dissection of his near-catastrophic stumble, for the old man's trademark gruffness. The critique didn't come. Valerie was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The granite edge was gone. It was just tired and old and oddly gentle. "For years," Valerie began, "I have listened to pianists. I have listened to fingers that could run faster than thought. I have listened to hearts that played only with passion, and heads that played only with calculation. I have listened to people play notes." He paused. The leaves rustled. "Today, for 3 minutes after you started again, I did not hear a single note." Leo turned his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I did not hear Liszt," Valerie continued. "I did not hear a blind prodigy. I did not hear an audition. I heard a young man explaining, in the only language he truly owns, what it is like to live in his world. I heard the blue room. I heard the headache. I heard the fight with the out-of-tune piano, and I heard the moment you stopped fighting. I heard a story. Leo felt a tightness in his throat. He looked down, though it made no difference. They will talk about your stumble, Valérie said, matter-of-factly. Some will say it disqualified you. Others will say you recovered. They will argue technique, tuning, tradition. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder again, the grip firm. But a few of them, the ones who have ears and not just hearing, they sat in that silence afterwards, and they felt what was in it. They know that something happened in that room that was not on the application form. But did I? Leo's voice was a rasp. Is it enough? Valérie let out a short, soft breath that was almost a laugh. Enough for what? For a prize? A certificate? Who knows? That is not for us to decide. He stood up, his knees cracking. It is enough for today. It is enough that you did not play the notes. You played the silence between them. That is the only thing worth playing. He started walking, knowing Leo would follow the sound of his footsteps. They left the park and moved back into the flow of the city. The question of the result hadn't vanished, but it had settled. It no longer screamed. It just hummed, a distant thing. Days later, the official letter arrived in Braille. Leo's fingers moved over the dots in his sunlit apartment. He had been accepted as a competitor. Not first chair, not with special fanfare. He was in. A simple, factual statement. He felt a flush of relief, but it was quiet. The bigger victory had already happened on that stage, in the silence after the music ended. The letter was just a map to the next place he would need to go. The night before he was to leave for the competition, he sat at his own piano, a well-worn upright in his small living room. He played softly, not practicing, just wandering. He found himself playing a simple, old melody his father had taught him on that first plastic keyboard. A folk-tuned dot as he played. He wasn't thinking about colors or shapes. He was just listening to the sound of the piano, a little warm, a little bright in the upper register. It was imperfect. It was real. He finished the tune and let his hands rest in his lap. The room was quiet, but it was a friendly quiet. The sightless man sat with his eyes closed, not to see the music, but to be inside it. And in the simple, silent room, there was no need for anything else.